thank you all for coming along this evening and joining us for this year's Lloyd Cox Memorial Lecture. I'm so delighted to see such a good crowd tonight, especially considering how cold and wintry it is outside. So I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Professor Sarah Robertson. I'm the Director of the Robertson Research Institute, and I am delighted to have as guests tonight some important people. We have Professor Jeffrey Robinson, of course, whom our institute is named after, David Cox, representing the Cox family. Thank you, David, again, and Professor Mike Brooks, and other distinguished guests. Welcome, everybody. So I'll start by acknowledging the land that we meet on today as the traditional land of the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country and acknowledge that the Kaurna people, as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region and their cultural and heritage beliefs, they still have an ongoing relationship with the country. So a couple of quick housekeeping items. If there's an emergency, people will need to leave by the stairs and meet at the rear, at the back, and the toilet facilities are around the side of the building and down one level. So tonight's event is jointly hosted by the Robertson Research Institute and the Lloyd Cox Foundation. The Institute is a collective of internationally renowned researchers in human reproduction, pregnancy and child health here at the University of Adelaide. And we focus on the early stages of life, and we really strive to improve the health and well-being of children and families over the life course and across generations here in Australia and around the world. The lecture series that we run every year is named after Professor Lloyd Cox, who was really one of the founding fathers of the work here in the university that led to the Institute coming together. So Lloyd Cox was appointed in 1958 as the founding professor of the University of Adelaide's Obstetrics and Gynecology Department, which was established first of all down at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Adelaide. He'd previously worked in New Zealand and the UK, and he came to Adelaide with a vision that was different. He really wanted this department to be a world leader in this academic field. And he believed that the way to get to that was to bring science and medicine together, and by tackling the really difficult challenges hand in hand in partnership and collaboration, that important strides forward or headway could be made. So that collegial approach has continued under successive leaders in the department. Professor Cox was succeeded by Jeffrey Robinson and also by Colin Matthews as the Professor for Reproductive Medicine, and ultimately by our speaker tonight, Professor Professor Robert Norman. So Robert Norman, to introduce Rob, is Professor of Reproductive and Periconceptional Medicine here at the University of Adelaide. He was the founding director of the Robertson Research Institute. He worked together with the university's inspired leadership to see the opportunity in this important research area. And he was also instrumentally involved in developing reproductive medicine here in South Australia. He's one of Australia's foremost fertility specialists. He's taken a strong stand on the ethical practice of reproductive medicine and is frequently talking about that in the media. So Rob trained in Africa, he studied in the United Kingdom, and together with Professor Colin Matthews, he built the financial foundation on which the Robertson Research Institute was launched. He's received the AO and Fellowship of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences, and has many awards from around the world, including the 3 major reproductive medicine societies. He continues an active national and international participation and leadership in research. And we're very lucky to have Rob agreeing to speak with us tonight, and he's going to be talking about on the topic of the reproductive revolution and how it changes science, sex and society. So with that provocative title, the floor is yours, Rob.
Thanks, Mike. Distinguished guests, colleagues and friends, in the short time that I've said that, 50 babies have been born. 350,000 babies are born every single year So reproduction is really part of our whole life. Countless new animals and plants, trillions, billions of them, are produced every single day, every minute. So reproduction is really part of everything in our life. It's the mainspring by which our society, our whole world keeps going. It's also the anvil on which evolution works on mutations and other areas to keep producing better and better, and sometimes worse and worse organisms. For many years, we have benefited from what our ancestors have done in choosing animals and plants by selective breeding without them knowing a single thing about science. And so we're beneficiaries of that today. So I think you'll see that reproduction is central to the whole of our lives. And therefore, I believe it must remain central to our lives today. And so what I'm going to talk about today is an unapologetic message to you about reproductive policies, politics, funding, science, being part of our society today. We know how controversial they are, but we often don't put very much money and time in trying to get them better. So that's my title, and it's going to be an overview of where I think we've come from and where we're going. So I'm going to ask you a simple question to wake you up at 6:15 on a Tuesday night. So my question is this: are there more people alive today than have lived and died in our history as a human species? I'm not going to ask you to put your hand up, because 50% of you will probably be wrong. But I'm going to try and answer the question. Now, I doubt that there are many of you who don't know about the Game of Thrones, so I thought I'd just help you a little bit. So in the Game of Thrones, Jon Snow is the champion of the living, and he is pitted against the White Walkers who have resurrected the dead and are in the last series that we're going to see with Game of Thrones. We're going to see this great battle. So who would have the greatest army if Jon Snow today could get together all the living? And who would have the greater army if the White Walkers were able to resurrect all the dead that have ever existed? We need to remember there have been 10 to 20,000 generations of humans as we know it. But during that time, the average life expectancy has probably been about 15 years. So there have been large numbers of people who died. So if Jon Snow was starting off in the year 1800, he would have had about 1 billion people. If you went back 500 years before that, there would have been 800 million. So what happened was the Black Death, the Black Plague came across Europe and killed off so many people. But if he now had an army, you'll see there's a massive increase. We're up to 7.6 billion people. So in the last 200 years, we've learned how to reproduce, and we've learned how not to die as often. If we waited for another 100 years, we're going to reach the plateau of what we think world population is going to be, and that will be 11.5 billion. Now, is that enough to have a bigger army than the White Walkers? No. 110 billion people are estimated to have lived and died before us in this room. So why do I talk about reproduction? Because if we're able to reproduce 120 billion people, surely it's unimportant. We ought to be learning about keeping people alive rather than getting them to reproduce. And this is what our funding mechanisms in this country do. We put all our money into 80-year-olds and their cardiovascular disease and their cancer and, understandably, mental health. But we put almost nothing into life at the beginning, getting things right at the beginning, and getting our society getting a good start. And this is what the Robertson Research Institute's about. It's about beginning life well so that we end life as healthy as we can possibly be. So when did the revolution start? Well, if we go back to the 1960s, when Professor Cox had started, we were about to undergo a massive social change. And Bob Dylan, who strangely enough got the Nobel Prize, gave us this wonderful set of things in the poem. The old people are past, things are changing. And so during the 1960s, there was tremendous change in terms of attitude to race. The feminist movement came about. Attitudes to sex were no longer binary. They included people who were gender fluid. There was lots of things happening about the Vietnam War. It was a time of massive change, and we'd expect in that time that reproduction would be at the forefront of that. And it was. There was legalization of termination of pregnancy. There was a recognition that we needed good contraception. I'm sorry, I've turned off the whole thing with that. So we had tremendous changes occurred in biology and technology, started to invest. There was a strong view about reproductive rights for women and for men. There was demand by consumers to get individual rights. We started to realize that the world was not just the United States and the United Kingdom. And in recent years, we've had the whole phenomenon of social media, whereby anyone can be an expert and can say what they like. Reproduction is also to do with human rights, and it's well embedded in the United Nations, and particularly in the Millennium Development Goals of the year 2000. And there are 8 strategies in the Millennium Goals to get people out of poverty, and 6 of them have everything to do with women and children and reproduction, particularly improving maternal health, number 5, promoting gender equality and empowering women, number 3. Number 6 is to do with sexually transmitted diseases, particularly HIV/AIDS. And number 4 was reducing child mortality. And so we are talking about human rights as well as about science and practice as well. Before that, we had many activists who got us up to the 1960s. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but for instance, I saw a patient today who told me she'd had a termination in Bangladesh. And I asked her where she went, and she said, I went to the Maury Stopes Clinic. And this is highly regarded, and she had a termination that was done safely and effectively. But there are many other people on this photograph that will have contributed to the strong push for family planning and for family control. We also need to remember that on this list, Catherine Dexter McCormack essentially funded the contraceptive pill. She gave large amounts of money for it to happen. And recently we've understood that Lillian Howell funded most of the IVF program when Steptoe Edwards couldn't get any money out of the British government. So women, for at least a century, have pushed very, very strongly about reproductive rights. We've also got many prominent scientific pioneers, and we could add many people to this list, but Gregor Mendel, through his work on genetics, taught us about single genes and the way that they go. Charles Darwin and Wallace with evolution. Lamarck, who was pilloried at the time, is now coming back as an epigeneticist. We had wonderful chemists that synthesized estrogen and progesterone hormones, and that led to the contraceptive pill. So the people in this picture were strong enough and politically active enough to produce the contraceptive pill. And it's amazing that 60 years on, the pill has been so successful with so few complications. And then my heroine is Rosalind Yallow, who is a Nobel-winning prize person who invented immunoassays, which was a very sensitive way of picking up hormones. And this completely opened up reproductive physiology. So let me go back to 3 people that I've known, either worked with or I've socialized with. So the first is Professor Lloyd Cox, and we've heard a little about him today. When Lloyd came to Adelaide, he had great fights with the local gynecologists, and he called all gynecologists failed surgeons. And at that time, the gynecologists and obstetricians were very arrogant. Patients had to do what they wanted to do. There was little concern about the community. And there was virtually no interaction with science, despite other specialities doing it. Lloyd Cox totally rearranged it. He put clinicians, the community, and the scientists together. He was responsible for getting legalization of termination of pregnancy in South Australia. He was the one who got the IVF legislation underway. There were so many things that he did, and he illustrates the modern clinical scientist, somebody who realizes that science, the community, and doctors have to work together. Professor Hugh Philpott was the person who taught me obstetrics and gynecology. He was a medical missionary in Nigeria when 150 babies out of every 1,000 that were born died within 7 days. And it was because they couldn't get into hospital. He invented a very simple graphical form of labor, monitoring labor called the partogram. And with this, he was able to reorganize the whole health service in Nigeria so that patients were referred very rapidly to hospital when there were early signs of problems. And the partogram has spread across the whole world and saved millions and millions of lives. He knew nothing about science because I worked with him and I knew that, but he was totally committed to the community. He felt responsible to them. And then finally there's Sir Bob Edwards, who won the Nobel Prize for IVF, and I spent 3 days with him in India on my own. I had a wonderful time with him. And he opened up embryology to the world. The reproductive biologists, particularly in the animal field, had done wonderful work for many years, but they hadn't interfaced with clinicians. And Bob Edwards brought them together. And through his inspired work with Steptoe, he was able to produce the world's first IVF baby. But he brought science into reproduction in a big way. And he had so many visionary ideas that came true. But all of these three people had another thing in characteristic. They were prepared to take on the authorities in pushing forward reproductive rights for people. Cox in terms of obstetrics and gynecology, Philpott in terms of social change to get much better outcomes for babies, and Edwards saying that science and the new ideas that they had should have a role and a discussion in politics and in policies. So IVF is 40 years old in terms of success, but it goes back a long way. The first egg was recovered by John Rock, who invented the pill in US. M.C. Chang had the first IVF organism that was born. That was a rabbit. Steptoe and Edwards had the first IVF baby. But the first Australian birth came very quickly after that. And then we started to do pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. That's taking a cell off an embryo. And that was done quite soon in 1989. And I want to pay tribute to Colin Matthews, who had a vision in all these areas. And we in Adelaide were always up there, if not first, second, or third in the world. And then the first sperm injection birth, whereby we needed only 1 sperm per egg. And we have some patients who have more eggs than they do the husband has a sperm. And this now allowed infertile men to avoid donor insemination and to have have their own genetic child. All of these things raised ethical issues, and particularly ICSI. Why should a healthy, fertile, normal woman go through a medical procedure just because she had a partner who was unhealthy and reproductively incapable? And in many areas of reproduction, we've got these strong ethical issues that we've not solved. If you think of termination of pregnancy, who should get the pill? Who should get IVF? All these things have not been solved in our society, and the whole debate about gay marriage has been around for ages as well. Reproductive issues are political issues, there are rights issues, and therefore it's great to be involved with patients, science, and the community. The other great thing that came out of this was our understanding about embryo development. We hadn't seen human embryos before, and initially they were able to be grown for 3 days and then for 7 days. With termination of pregnancy, information came about the organization of organs. But there was this great gap between 1 week and maybe 6 weeks in which we knew very little. And that's the great black box at the moment that we're starting to work on and trying to discover it. Let me use an illustration of development. These 3 people have all got XY chromosomes. They're all males. The top one is a supermodel who is a female. She was born with no receptors for testosterone. She's grown up as a female. She is a female. The second one is a great athlete who's won a gold medal at the Olympic Games. She has testes and ovaries in the same body, and she has a uterus. She has identified as a female. And the third one is even more interesting. This is an anonymous person from the Dominican Republic who was born entirely as a girl, but at the age of puberty developed a penis, became a male, and got married and had children. And there's a village in the Dominican Republic where this is completely normal. About 1 in 100 children will do this. They're totally able to make the change from being female to male, and there's a celebration when it happens. So all of this has come about because we understand now how the reproductive system develops in the fetus. And I'm not going to go into details, but the X chromosomes or other chromosomes related to that lead to the testes or the ovary. Testosterone is produced, external genitalia occur, and brain development is influenced. And I think the great debate we've got at the moment about gender fluidity is a mixture of all these anatomical, hormonal, and psychological things that are occurring. So reproduction, again, is adding to our understanding about human development, psychology, and sexuality. So what do I think the reproductive revolution has produced? Well, first of all, and I'm going to show you this, we're on top of the population growth, I believe. Secondly, we're getting much safer pregnancies, whereby women and children have much more confidence of being safe. Thirdly, we've got a massive amount of information about the reproductive system that we are now sharing with many other branches of science. Then I believe we're on the verge of conquering infertility, so that everybody ultimately will be able to have a child that's genetically theirs. Stem cell technology has arisen, certainly embryonic stem cell technology, from our understanding of reproduction and embryology, and cellular therapy is going to transform medicine. And finally, we are seeing, whether we like it or not, a tremendous change in consumer attitudes. We're seeing different families, and we are battling and celebrating at times in the way that we bring up our families. And it means that people can have children even if they're not in a conventional relationship. So let's deal with population control first. So this is what total fertility looked like in the 1960s. So all the red and orange and yellow are where the woman is having more than 6 babies or 6 pregnancies in her lifetime. The ones that are in blue or light blue are the ones where it's near replacement. And you'll see in 1960 that across South America, Asia, and Africa, that reproduction was very, very high. If I take you forward 20 years, you'll see the blue, which is below replacement or at replacement, is now taking over. And if I take you to where we think we are now, you'll see that many countries in the world are now blue countries. The two outstanding areas are Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia, particularly the Pakistan, Bangladesh sort of areas. And these are the areas in which total fertility is going down, but it's going to keep going for many years to come. This is from the United Nations, where it's talking about the percentage of countries who've got zero net population growth. And if I take you to the second from the right, you'll see at the moment that nearly half the countries in the world are not going to reproduce their populations beyond replacement value at the moment. And if we go forward another 5 to 10 years, that's going to be 2/3. So the world is going to reach a plateau, but for at least a century, we're going to see, particularly in Africa, an ongoing rise in the population. Nigeria is going to become the third most populous country in the world. It's easily going to overtake the United States. Safer pregnancies and healthier mothers are really important to our population growth. This is maternal mortality across the world 5 years ago. All those colours that are dark red or purple are very high maternal mortality, and the other countries are much less than that. So again, in those areas where population growth is so marked, we've got very high maternal mortality. 1,000 women a day die as a result of their pregnancy. If we look at childhood mortality, it's almost identical position. We're seeing large numbers of children dying in Africa and to some extent in Southeast Asia, and 15,000 children a day under the age of 5 die. So the secret to fertility drops are not only contraception, although that's really important, but it's making sure that children survive to adulthood. It's making sure that children are not just used to be workers, but they're educated and they've got a future. The status of women is improved, that education is there, that they have jobs and they have incentive not to reproduce as teenagers, and also that the male population doesn't force them to do that. So I believe that the reproductive revolution's made massive difference to population. It's going to make a great difference to safety of pregnancy, and it's going to lead to much healthier, less children who survive and are healthy. So these are the challenges across the world at the moment, and they're not necessarily technological challenges, they're organizational and financial. We need proper, adequate antenatal care, well-supervised labor by people who know what they're doing, breastfeeding, family spacing, adequate contraception, and as we get new and emerging technologies, particularly in the developed world, these will be used. I'd like to take you through a couple of areas that I think are developing now, and I want to talk a little bit about what happens early in pregnancy, early in life, and how it impacts on future health. We've known for a very long time that if a woman is iodine deficient, that her child has a very high chance of intellectual deficiency, so-called cretinism, and other conditions. We know if we put iodine back into her diet, we completely eliminate this. Folic acid is known by almost every woman seeking to become pregnant, but it's important to take it because it statistically reduces open neural tube defect. We've had horrendous experiences with thalidomide and also with another drug called diethylstilbestrol, and their effect on congenital abnormalities in thalidomide and cancer in the offspring after DES. These things we know, and we're cautious about them at the moment. However, we're facing now the issue of a large number of people who are underweight and overweight and heading through pregnancy in this condition. And if we think that 50% of people in Australia are overweight or obese in reproductive years, this has to have a consequence. So out of this has come the developmental origins of health and disease, or DOHAD hypothesis, for which David Barker was one of the pioneers, but I want to pay tribute to Geoffrey Robertson, who was right there at the very beginning of this. And to make it very, very simple, a child that's got perfect DNA that's growing in the uterus can be significantly impaired by an external environment that impacts on that child. And the baby is judging, in a simple way, the external environment. And when it's born, it will adapt to that environment. And so we think that under certain circumstances, a baby growing in the womb is programmed wrongly for the environment that's outside, which it may be very different from what it was predicting. And there's very strong evidence now that many diseases, ranging from metabolic diseases through cardiovascular, even through to mental and psychological diseases, are programmed by what happens in the uterus. And the logic behind this, for those who fund health services, is if you intervene very early on or you prevent it, you'll follow the lower line where you get relatively few consequences. But if you leave it alone and you let this develop throughout pregnancy and throughout neonatal and adolescent life, your problems are so much greater at the end of life, and they're going to cost you so much more. This is an area that I think our health services, and particularly our health funders, do not understand. A small amount of money spent at this stage of life, a lot of intellect put into this stage of life, will save us so much problem later on in life. How does this happen? Well, forgive me, for those of you who are molecular geneticists in the room, I'm sure I'm going to say this wrong, but basically we have this concept of epigenetics, that the DNA can be modulated by the environment. Genes can be turned on and off, either fully or partially. And so you get a plant, like a petunia, in which the DNA is the same in every single cell, but only certain cells have a color turned on and others have the color turned off. Same thing with a cat. The DNA is the same in every single cat, every single cell of this cat. To make it a little more scientific, there's a mouse called the agouti mouse. And if you give the mother more folic acid during pregnancy, you can completely change the coat color. The animal's very healthy, but you can switch on and on a coat color by what you give the mother. And we can see this in the embryo. We can see the genes being turned on and off in the embryo. And then you have monozygous identical twins, absolutely the same DNA. But as life goes on, they have different epigenetic markers. They can develop different diseases, different cancers, and many other things can be variable. So Lamarck, who was pilloried, thought the environment was everything responsible. He may not be correct, but it looks like some of the things he said were reasonable. So as an egg is released, as it goes down the fallopian tube and it gets to the uterus and it's fertilized in the fallopian tube, there are many environmental factors that can impact on it. So some researchers in the Robertson Research Institute have shown that you can poison an egg just by your diet. Others have shown that the environment in the fallopian tube, or if you're doing IVF in the culture medium, can completely reprogram that embryo. Sperm is really seriously affected by a whole number of things, including cigarette smoke, diet, and drugs. And so we have this precious embryo, which is there for life, that can be impacted by so many things around it. And again, it teaches us that this is a critical stage of life at which we should be concentrating. Nutrition is really important, and good and bad nutrition, we know, across the world is occurring. Less and less people are getting undernourished, but it's still important, and many more people are getting overnourished. And the bottom panel shows you that in our region, India, China, Indonesia, and Australia, the body mass index, which reflects weight, is increasing. And The red and yellow parts, which show increasing body mass index, are also increasing, and the purple ones, which show low body mass index, are decreasing. So diet and nutrition are going to impact. We've got abundant animal evidence that this is working adversely on embryos and on offspring. And we have now very good evidence from places such as West Africa that even a changing normal diet can make a big impact on that developing fetus. So preconception care is not about deciding the night that you're about to have sex that you need to take folic acid. It's more than that. It goes back to children, making sure that they're well nourished, particularly that they've got iron, for instance, in places such as India, that they're protected from getting pregnant too early, that the rights of women are increased so that they are able to choose when they want to have children rather than their spouse or their society decide it, that we manage substance abuse, and that we teach people how they can maximize their reproductive potential to avoid sexually transmitted diseases, HIV, etc. We hear very little about preconception care out in the community, admittedly because 50% of people don't plan their pregnancy, but at least we could be doing a lot more in teenage years and in adolescence. There's just one other side thing I'd like to point out. Pregnancy is a marker of what's going to happen later on. If you've got a blood pressure disorder called preeclampsia, you are much more likely to get heart disease and diabetes and hypertension later in life, even though it disappears after pregnancy. If you have diabetes in pregnancy, even though it disappears after pregnancy, you are much more destined to get diabetes later. And so those of us who work in reproduction, we're in many ways guardians of the future, that we are there to help people to avoid diseases in the future, to ask them to look for surveillance. And so when someone has a baby, we don't want to just dump them and hand them over to someone else. We need to be partners with them. For men who think they're safe, well, if you've got erectile dysfunction and no one knows why you've got it, you're much more likely to get cardiovascular disease and stroke. It's a marker 20 years before it happens. And if you have early or delayed puberty or early or delayed menopause, there are a series of other conditions that go with it. So reproduction is not just about having babies, it's about general health throughout life. So this is our concept. But if you've got perfect DNA from centuries, billions of years of evolutionary development, and you make a great start by the right environment, you follow the green line, and it's only later in life that you might get diseases and disability. If you start off badly with the same DNA, you follow the red line, and you're much more likely to get into problems earlier in life. So again, it's logical to intervene early. How this happens, we're not entirely sure. We may damage DNA, like with some things like alcohol. We may have the epigenome affected, mitochondria. There are many other things that can happen. But we do know that planning and looking after the very earliest stages of life have the greatest investments. I think we're about to conquer infertility, and I'd like to take you through my particular area. So when we look back 200 years, and we've got great records where people married early, they were monogamous, they had no contraception, the prevalence of infertility was about 2 to 5%. It's now around about 15%. And a lot of this is due to environmental factors, but it's also due to the fact that, quite rightly, people are getting educated, having jobs, and as a result, they're delaying having children. Sexually transmitted disease is much more common in the last century than it ever was before. And we now have advances in medication, diagnosis that we can do to help. In Denmark, 5 to 6% of all babies born are from assisted reproduction. In Australia, it's 4 to 5%. And having just come back from China, 2% of Chinese are being born from IVF. We expect this could go up to 10 to 20%. So things are going to happen in this area. IVF has radically changed the world. And I won't go through all these things here, but it does force us to re-examine the moral status of the embryo and what we think about the beginnings of life. It opens up the whole of science to us in terms of developmental origins. It's allowed us to get stem cells. And increasingly we have to think about genetics because, as I'll show you in a minute, we can diagnose the genetics of an embryo before it goes back. Obviously, there were early problems. When IVF was first introduced, there was strong community resistance from the church, from radical feminists, from a whole bunch of people. In Australia now, 95% of people accept IVF as being a legitimate medical intervention. Back then, we had incredibly bad results, so we put back 4 or 5 embryos and we had multiple pregnancies. Now we're down to less than 5% in Australia. Back then, we were really concerned we were doing damage to women and babies. And although we're not totally through the woods, we think that the evidence is still pretty good that mothers don't suffer long-term ill effect and that babies are generally pretty safe. However, we've had the rise of commercialization and across the world, many dubious practices. Donor sperm was a challenge very early on, and Colin Matthews was one of the first people to set up a frozen sperm bank. I looked up the first donor sperm pregnancy that ever occurred. This was a gynecologist in America who was doing a routine operation on a woman who was infertile. He knew the husband had no sperm. The medical student provided the sperm, and she was inseminated without her knowledge. We've moved on from that now, where even anonymity is not allowed, that everybody has to know who the sperm donor is. And we've got through infection. The first fresh sperm donations were associated with HIV in Australia. You can go to a catalogue and choose anyone you like from that catalogue and have the sperm sent to you. Single-sex couples can now have children. But we have problems about family information. We've also got issues about how many children a donor should produce. Donor eggs have opened up avenues for women who've gone past menopause or had early menopause. And again, you can buy eggs anywhere in the world that you want to go. Together with surrogacy, it allows single men to have children. Embryo donation, you can have multiple parents. I've got a patient of mine who's given birth who legitimately has got 5 different parents. And I won't go into the detail of that, but someone gave an egg, someone gave a sperm, someone had a baby, donated the extra embryos onto this woman. So these are the things that can happen. And although it's closed down a lot now, there's been rampant and really bad commercialization of these practices throughout Asia. We can now screen the genetics of an embryo. So on day 5, we can take 3 or 4 cells from an embryo, and theoretically we can do the whole genome of that embryo, freeze it, work out the genome, and then put it back. At the moment, we do this for single gene disorders such as cystic fibrosis, but theoretically it could be done for many things. We use it to make sure that the chromosomes in the embryo are normal before we put them back. So genetic screening of embryos is going to be a great challenge for our society. We accept cystic fibrosis, but are we going to look for intellect? Are we going to look for hair color? There are many things that we're going to be challenged about. Then we're also challenged by age. So women, as they get older, are less likely to have a child, get pregnant, they're more likely to have a miscarriage and a congenital abnormality. So the optimal age does not fit in with our socioeconomic use at the moment. We have educational pressures. There are not very nice men around sometimes. And so there are many challenges for people having children earlier in life. But we now have opportunities to rejuvenate eggs. We think we'll be able to take bad eggs and make them better. We can select genetically normal eggs out of older eggs. many women are choosing to store their eggs much younger before they want to have children. And donor eggs are freely available, and the oldest woman ever to have a child, I think, was 68. There's also been a suggestion that you can freeze your parts of your ovaries earlier on in life and then have them back later. Then we have the challenge of new reproductive technologies. So we've got the ability to remove genes and put them back in animals. There'll be personalized culture media where we can direct embryos in certain directions. We've got this great debate about putting back new mitochondria. And then there's the opportunity to store tissue if you're going to go through chemotherapy and lose your eggs, or store sperm. And then we've got this massive consumer demand at the moment. I often feel like a waiter in a reproductive restaurant where people come and look at the menu and say, I'll have that and I'll pay for that. And if it's not on your menu, I'll go to the next restaurant down the street. And so consumers are very demanding about what they want now for fertility, and doctors are often very placid and accepting of what's going on. I know that I'm assessed on the internet. There's kind of TripAdvisor for doctors where you can say what you think of this doctor and whether they're too old or whether they're too young or whether they're not friendly or whatever. And so consumer demand on reproduction is stronger than almost any other branch of medicine. And so we're under that pressure. Embryology's opened up with the reproductive revolution as well. And we have this big issue of where do we draw the line? Initially, we could only grow embryos for 3 days. And then we could grow them for 6 or 7 days. And Mary Warnock in the United Kingdom put in a law that said you couldn't grow embryos for more than 14 days. Well, now, groups in the United States and Cambridge are able to grow embryos right up to 14 days with no problems at all. And at that stage, they have to discard them. But theoretically, they could grow them longer. They could see how organs develop. They could look and see why miscarriages occur, why congenital abnormalities happen. And so we have this red line that we've arbitrarily drawn. And you and I as a community have to decide, do we move the red line for science's sake, or have we gone too far? We can now assemble embryos. So if I could speculate, we may be able to custom-made embryos, rather like we do 3D printing. So when an embryologist looks at an embryo, he sees, or she sees those cells on the top. But if you use particular stains, even from a 4-cell embryo, you can see which cells are going to go which direction. And in mice, they've been able to take out these cells, or use embryonic stem cells, and then reassemble them artificially. And these different colors show the different cell lines. So in a mouse, they're able to come up with a designed embryo. And the human embryo shown on the bottom there is stained for these cells. That's a natural embryo, and that's a day 12 embryo. So are we going to see embryo assembly rather like Brave New World? And then also there's a great demand for organs. So we know that in, say, a monkey, that we can insert genes that will go all the way through to an adult animal. Now, the illustration here is they put in a green fluorescent protein just to illustrate, and they had a monkey that fluoresced in the dark. But theoretically, you can put any genes into embryonic stem cells or into an embryo, and then hopefully, or I'm not sure if hopefully is the right word, but you should be able to reassemble these into an organ. And so there's designs to make livers and hearts and bones. So will we be growing organs out of this? And again, you'll see the ethical challenges that we as a society face. We've gone through stem cell therapy as a controversy. We've got no problem with adult stem cells, which is what the bone marrow people use, for instance, where the stem cell can only become a blood cell. But embryonic stem cells open up for us the possibility that we can move cells to be nerves or hearts or bones or whatever we want. And this is highly controversial. And then we have the invention by a Japanese group that they can take adult stem cells and reprogram them back and then send them off in the direction that they like. So these are all the challenges that we've got in terms of stem cell therapy. It's also possible in all animals except humans to take stem cells and make eggs and sperm. So you would take embryonic stem cells, you'd put them in the right environment, and you'd end up with eggs. If you put it into a testis, you'll end up with sperm. And if I could take the horrific example, the same individual could produce sperm and eggs and fertilize them. We wouldn't allow that, but that is potentially possible. Genetics, reproductive genetics is about to explode on the scene. And ultimately, I think all of us who are going to have children are going to need to know our genetics, because there's so much that we can do to prevent genetic disease. At the moment, almost every person, in fact, every person in South Australia, is offered cell-free DNA testing in pregnancy, so-called harmony test, for those of you who know it. Not everyone accepts it, but we know that fetal DNA circulates in the blood. We can pull it out, and we can tell what chromosomes are present. We soon, if we can't do it already, will be able to sequence the whole genome by 8 or 9 weeks from somebody's blood. And that opens the whole opportunity for cellular and other therapies for that child. Mitochondria replacement is also on the agenda. You will have heard about three-parent families. This is where the mitochondria are damaged in a woman and her babies are affected. And it's now possible to give her good mitochondria, but those mitochondria come from a different person. And so you have nuclear DNA from the mother and the father, and you have mitochondrial DNA from someone else. This is now licensed for use in certain centres in Britain, and babies have already been born in Britain, in America and Mexico. And then all scientists know that we've contributed gene knockouts. We've been able to knock out genes in animals and look for disease. We've been able to overexpress genes, and we're able to clone animals. So these are the contributions reproductive medicine has made to genetics. And now the big challenge is this technology called CRISPR, where we can delete a gene very accurately and put it back, although that's controversial whether it's accurate. This is a human embryo, it's stained, and the right-hand side is where a developmental gene's been knocked out, and that embryo is abnormal. So the potential for, say, removing cystic fibrosis and putting back the right gene is there. I'm going to end off with just a couple of topics. One is ethics. We've had many challenges and failures in reproductive medicine. I've talked about thalidomide. In the Eastern Europe after the war, instead of using contraception, termination of pregnancy was used. Millions of babies killed unnecessarily. In India, we've had selection for males and feticide of female fetuses. In some parts of the world, there's forced sterilization. And I think the China one-child policy is now generally agreed to have been a great mistake. We've got promotion of celebrity and doctors, where people's appearance and money is more important than their brains. We've had dishonesty in many parts of the world with the way that it's practiced. We've had the use of IVF when it's not appropriate. We've had commercialization and commodification of fertility. And we've had virtually no male responsibility for reproduction. So these are the challenges I think we face in the future. We need a proper male contraceptive that a woman can trust. We need to work out whether we can grow embryos longer. There will be artificial wombs. How long we can grow embryos and babies for, we don't know. Are we going to alter the embryonic genome? Are we going to allow cloning of people? And remember, a twin is a clone. Are we going to allow sex selection so that people can choose the baby, the gender they want? Are we going to allow paid surrogacy and donor eggs? Are we going to allow people to have children when they're 50, 60, 70 years old? What are we going to do about gender fluidity and choice? And for me, what's really important is how do we take the technology we've got and make it cheap and simple for the millions of people who haven't got children in developing countries. So why am I here today? Well, it's because the university is damn good at what we do. So Jeffrey Robertson really set up a lot of the department and what was going on after Lloyd Cox. Colin Matthews, who's often not recognised, really laid the basis for reproductive medicine in the state and indeed in Australia. Julie Owens, I've forgotten Julie's exact title, but Julie was the one who really had the vision for the Robertson Institute. And Mike Brooks phoned me up one day when I was in Heathrow Airport and said, would you like $1 million to set up the Robertson Research Institute? So these people have made what we are in Adelaide today, and we will lose it if we don't look after it. The Robertson Research Institute looks after people from preconception all the way through to adolescence, and we've got very talented people. We've done really well. We've integrated with science from across the universities. We've worked with clinical groups at the Women's and Children's Hospital and fertility clinics. We've had huge impact on state and national policies around reproduction. And increasingly, we're working in public health and epidemiology, looking at data linkage. So the complete package is here. This is the most important area, and the university needs to value this. So big questions ahead. I'm reaching the end of my time, so I won't go through details here. But these are big questions that are worldwide importance and interface with politics, policies, and medical research around the world. So to summarize, reproductive research is central to biological sciences and benefits society now and for the future. And the investment in early life is so sensible, but so little practiced. It's the best investment we can make in health. It benefits everyone, whether you're young, whether you've got children or not, whether you're an adult or whether you're older. T.S. Eliot had it right. He said, we shall not cease from exploration, and at the end of our exploring, we will arrive at where we started and know the place for the first time. If we want to know how to deal with adult disease and health, we need to go back to the beginning, because that's where the answer is. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rob, for that really incredible exploration, I think, of this amazing area of science, and congratulations again on your fantastic and important contribution to it. I think you've really illustrated how critical it is to understand the origin of life and how influential that is in terms of the health of our societies and our communities, but also the challenges that lie therein around dealing with the ethical questions that this raises for us. And I'm sure people will have questions on some of those topics. So, will you take some questions? We have a few minutes.
Sure, if there's time.
Can I ask you perhaps to start with, do you think, what are the causes of why infertility is still on the rise? I mean, it can't all be about age. Is it about our environment and the world we live in as well?
I think if we go back several years, I think sexually transmitted infections were very common. We do have the issue of age, and we need to remember the aging male is almost as, can be as infertile as the aging female, and certainly passes on genetic diseases that we would not normally see. I think socioeconomically, our society has really got it wrong. I mean, if the median house price in Sydney is over $1 million, what single salary will provide that? I think opportunities for people to have maternity leave and childcare, I think these are all things that put people off. But also maybe, as somebody said, we're often too picky with our partners, and maybe we need to accept the better rather than the best.
Is that advice?
Hi, Rob.
Claire?
It's Claire here. Wonderful talk. Thank you. You mentioned that reproductive health is a political issue, and many of your early slides, the sad reality, for example, of very large numbers of babies being born to each woman in Africa, a lot of these problems you talked about are really all based on poverty. So what do you think that reproductive scientists and clinicians should be doing to advocate to end poverty?
Thank you. I was really inspired by Philpott, who was my professor. And he said to me, Rob, we can drop perinatal mortality to 50. Now, in South Australia, it's about 8. He says there's nothing medical science can do beyond that until society changed. And this was in South Africa, where the politics was so toxic. And since the politics has changed there, it's dropped a lot. So I do think we need to be involved. Most of us don't want to be involved in politics or ethics. We just want to get on with our job and do our work. But I think reproductive scientists, biologists, and clinicians do need to get involved. And when the Australian government cuts funding for contraception, when Donald Trump's not prepared to fund anything overseas that has anything to do with reproduction, I think we do need to have a voice about it. And we do need to say these things. I think there are also other things. I was very influenced by Australians who came to work in Africa, which is where I was, for a very poor salary because they felt motivated to work there. And I don't see why we as clinicians and scientists don't go and spend a month or 2 a year helping people around the world to get things going.
You're on the right, left.
Rob, thank you for a wonderful overview. You've raised and outlined the challenges we have now and will have in the near and relatively distant future for ethical debate. From your perspective, what are good national and international models for having this debate? We have so many vested interests, but are there areas in the world that you've seen where these debates can be constructive and lead to good outcomes?
I think the obstetricians do it really well. There have been very large clinical trials across the whole world that have answered big first world questions, such as eclampsia and preeclampsia. And I think the reason the obstetricians do it well is that they're not generally consumed by money and commercialization. I think we need to get above nationalization, or being a national of a particular country, and see ourselves as world citizens. When it comes to this, we can support our football team at the World Cup, but when it comes to the global health football team, we need to be all participants in that. Strange enough, countries like Cuba have done pretty well, despite very little money, because they've had very strong strategies in that area. So I think an obstetrician can probably answer that much better than a gynecologist. Gynecologists have very little answers in this area.
Rob, when we have a situation like fetal alcohol syndrome, and it being such a related and proven bad effect on pregnancy, what would you see as being the political and social warfare that we can undertake to counter such a disorder for ongoing generations?
The debate about alcohol is a very difficult one because the NHMRC recommend that women who are seeking to become pregnant should stop alcohol. That's not been a very popular message, although it's been a very good marker for people at parties to see who's planning a pregnancy as to whether they've moved from alcohol to water. But the problem in Australia is we've labelled one particular group in our society as being the major problem. And we know that in some parts of Australian society, the fetal alcohol syndrome is 10 or 20% of all babies that are born, which is a devastating impact on that child. We don't really have good information across the rest of Australia. And so I think we have to get away from labelling and blaming particular groups. And we have to take a whole of politics approach to it. When people get blamed, they get very resistant. And I think we just need to engage with the groups in which we know it's so common to see what we can do. Now, many of the women in these communities have taken a strong stand on getting alcohol-free areas. but that's not the sole solution. So education for some people is worth it. I think policing for others is important. But overall, those who supply the alcohol and make a profit from it need to be responsible. We've seen this with tobacco, and we've done really well with tobacco. And somehow we need to do it with alcohol without blaming people.
I think we'll take one last question here.
Hi Rob, thanks so much. There's great research being done from a medical science point of view, which doesn't always get through to clinical work, and I think there's sometimes a great divide between medical scientists and clinicians. How do you think we can better facilitate that communication and working together as clinical researchers and scientists going forward?
Thanks, Amanda. I've grown up in an environment where clinicians and scientists have worked together, they've had coffee together, they've published together, and the atmosphere at the Queen Elizabeth when I was working there was unbelievable, and I think at the Queen Vic and the Women's and Children's was really good. I see a divide occurring now that the clinicians are quite separate in many ways from the scientists. The other thing is the academics are sometimes quite remote from the clinicians, so we come up with guidelines which are evidence-based and very sensible, but our clinical colleagues often believe that it's not real-world medicine. We do randomized controlled trials, and people don't believe that that has much relevance to their patient. So there needs to be better communication, there needs to be more respect for outstanding clinicians and scientists. But I think we have many models in the past, and in many parts of the medical school and other disciplines, where that marriage is fantastic and it's benefit for the patient. I think in obstetrics and gynecology in Adelaide, I think the divergence has gone too far.
I think we'll finish there, Bill, with thanking you, Rob, for those really important insights and wise words, particularly at the end, and encouraging us to continue to move on, to progress this field. We will be following the fantastic light that you've given us, and I think really respect and are very grateful for the incredible input that you've made over so many years. So thank you once again for tonight and for all of your contributions over the years.